right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jean Cannon. I'm the curator for North American Collections here at the Hoover Archives. Lovely to see you all. I just wanted to let you know we're going to take a few minutes to let people enter the webinar, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, so that everyone can get acquainted with the site. And then I'm going to introduce our Deputy Director of the Hoover Institution and also Director of Library and Archives, Eric Wakin, who is going to introduce you today to our speaker, Luke Nichter. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone here in the room and on Zoom. Thanks for coming. I'm Eric Wakin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Hoover Institution and the Sparky and Jane Hauk, Director of the Library and Archives. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Luke Nichter, who will be speaking on Watergate at 50, which is the second lecture in our accompanying our current gallery exhibit, about which there are cards on your chairs, Unprecedented Watergate and Power in America. A few minutes more on Luke in a moment. Let me just welcome you to the Hoover Institution and thank some of the people who made this event possible. First of all, our director, Condoleezza Rice, who's been an unstinting supporter of the Library and Archives and of the growth of this institution in our second 100 years. Also the overseers and the other donors that support the institution and our mission. Without their generous donations, nothing we do would be possible. Although we're fully part of Stanford University, we are 100% privately funded. And Stanford gives us a tiny bit of money to support the archive. So it's without the generosity of our donors, nothing we do here would be possible. We're here because of the vision of one man, Herbert Hoover, who more than 100 years ago sent his famous telegram, which said, among other things, it was quite short: collect materials on war. He gave a $50,000 donation in 1919, and today's purchasing power is roughly $900,000 or $1 million. That was his deed of gift. And from that Hoover War Library, we've become the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. And our mission has expanded from being essentially a library to being a public policy research institute. And by operating budget, we're the largest think tank in America, just for comparison, which is quite amazing. We have economists, historians, political scientists, professors of literature, culture, and otherwise working both in the archives on our library and archive collections, but also in working groups on various things from state and local taxation issues, macroeconomic issues, national security issues, and so on. So it's a really unusual institution in having a library and archives and a public policy side. Mr. Hoover said this about the Hoover Institution: the institution is not and must not be a mere library, but with these purposes as its goal, the institution must dynamically point the road to peace, to personal freedom, and to the safeguards of the American system. And I like to think that these talks are exactly what Mr. Hoover would have wanted. We're not just a mere library, we are engaging with culture and economics and politics and thinking and history, and that's why Luke is here to help us out with that. Now, let me say a few words about Luke, and then we'll let him speak. As many of you have already noted, today's the actual 52nd anniversary of perhaps the most famous burglary in American history, June 17th, 1972, when a group of folks broke into the DNC headquarters in Watergate, thereby causing Watergate to be a term that denoted all sorts of political scandals in the world since then. This afternoon, we're welcoming Professor Luke Nichter, who's one of the foremost experts on many things, one of which is the secret White House recordings from the times of FDR through Richard Nixon. Luke is currently professor of history and James H. Cavanaugh Endowed Chair in Presidential Studies at Chapman University. His specialty is the Cold War, the modern presidency, and U.S. political and diplomatic history, with a focus on the long 1960s. He's also a best-selling author or editor of 8 books, including most recently The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Today, Luke is going to share his knowledge and research on the Nixon era. Before I hand the podium over to him, I just want to take a minute to thank our exhibitions team, Samira Bazorgi, Kira Peacock, and Marissa Ree, who've worked tirelessly along with the curator, Jean Cannon, on the exhibition that's upstairs in the tower. I urge you to take a look at it when you have a moment. Now, please give a warm Hoover welcome to Luke Nichter.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Eric, and also to Jean and the rest of your library and archives team for inviting me here for this speaker series that coincides not only with the 50th anniversary of Watergate, specifically the 52nd, as we heard, of the actual break-in, which sort of got that whole process started back in the early 1970s, but also coinciding with your important exhibit. As Eric just mentioned over in the tower, I went over and saw it myself earlier today, so if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to do so. I also want to give a special welcome. I have several students here in the room or on Zoom from Chapman. At this point, grades are turned in. You owe me nothing further, but you came here and you know, that good on you for doing that. I teach the most popular class I teach is a course called U.S. Politics in the Age of Richard Nixon. So it's as much about that era as it is our own. And they probably all agree the number of times we get sidetracked, and we really talk about politics today. But so much about that era is a starting point for politics today. So it's not hard to look for those similarities if you're looking for them. It's also great to be back at the Hoover Institution, which is becoming one of the last places, in my opinion, where one can engage in serious historical inquiry alongside encouraging colleagues, supported by a world-class library and archives. I've been fortunate to visit more often in recent years since my academic home moved from Texas to California in 2021, making me probably one of the only people moving in that direction in the last few years. This is not the first time that I've been asked to say what I really think about Watergate, but it is the first time I've done so in public. It's still a work in progress. You know, how could it not be with so many records still closed and hundreds of hours of Nixon's White House tapes are still unreleased, you know, even as we meet today. It's a subject I've actually generally avoided writing about, not because I haven't been thinking about it, however, but for a young historian starting out about 20 years ago, which is when I was, you know, there really weren't many subjects more politically incorrect than sort of probing Watergate at the time, challenging the conventional wisdom that the corrupt administration of Richard Nixon had to go, or that the national media performed admirably in their coverage of a challenging and fast-paced story, or that while it was traumatic for the nation, Nixon's resignation ultimately showed the system worked, a phrase that's been repeated many times since. Some of you are familiar with it. It would not surprise anyone here familiar with my work that I'm inclined to challenge much of the conventional wisdom of this, in large part because this is the moment to do so, given the passage of time and the new perspectives that we have today. What I would like to do today is trace the initial narrative of Watergate as it was constructed in the wake of that break-in on June 17th, 1972, the reaction to it at the time, and the opportunity that I think we have today for a fresh reassessment of the subject and the broader time period. I'd also like to leave plenty of time for discussion at the end. This is a crowd that could have quite a few questions. This is a subject that lends itself to that sometimes. And if I don't know the answer to a question, I'm not afraid to say so, although I'll be glad to follow up later. But first, I'd like to offer a little background in terms of where I'm coming from to you as I talk about Watergate. I was born in 1977, which means I've had a lot to learn about Watergate. That's probably intrinsic for a lot of you who lived through it and were seared by those hearings on TV or on radio, or just down to the minutia of household names in Nixon's staff and things that, things that you grew up with when living through the broader Vietnam era. But it also means being born after all that I come at it, I think, with a slightly cleaner slate, so to speak. I wasn't around to protest on a campus. Perhaps I might have. I wasn't wearing a uniform in Southeast Asia. And of course, I wasn't in government. I've decided over the last several years to dedicate a lot of energy to rewriting the history of the 1960s, including 3 volumes to date. First, I worked on a biography of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., which is not only a book about an overlooked and really maligned consequential figure, but also a volume heavy on foreign policy in the 1960s, as well as how the modern Republican Party took shape and where the various philosophical strands descended from, whether on the one hand, Robert Taft and Barry Goldwater, to on the other hand, Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan. Secondly, the last book that Eric mentioned in the introduction, a book on the 68 presidential election, really heavy on the politics and the domestic policy of the time, kind of leading, both of these kind of leading up, right up to the edge of the Watergate era. The first to have cooperation from all four major sides, Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace, and Richard Nixon, which demonstrates, as I argue in the book, what happens when the chaos that millions of Americans witnessed on television actually reaches the highest echelons of politics, leading LBJ to prefer his old nemesis, Richard Nixon, as his successor, a book that's also served as a kind of dystopian roadmap for our own current politics today. And currently, and finally, I'm working a book now really on a political history of the whole 1960s with a focus on Johnson's presidency. So I guess I'm in a race with a 90-year-old who's much more famous than I am, named Robert Caro in New York, to see who finishes first. And I always say, if I get 10% of his audience, I think I'll be doing pretty well. And probably in some way, I owe him a debt of gratitude, because he's inspired my interest in the subject as I grew up, and probably a lot of yours too in this time period. And I think what I'm seeing, I still have a few years to go in that book. I've never written about a whole presidency before, so it's really daunting in terms of the volume of material that you have to go through. But the direction that I'm generally going is that I think the break between LBJ and the liberals in his party, or really their break with him, I think, was about much more than Vietnam. And that the seeds of that break were planted much earlier than Vietnam, went back quite a bit further. And ultimately, this book will really set up a foundation for an exploration of Nixon's America, kind of moving on to the 1970s, the state of the nation and the world of the time, and the politics that he inherited. So these three books I've been working on, either done or in progress right now, have become a kind of training ground for when I turn my attention to the writing of the history of the 1970s, which has not really been written yet, believe it or not. It seems like maybe it has been, but it really hasn't been, in large part because a lot of records haven't been opened yet. They're still to this day. Certainly not written by someone who spends 100 days a year in archives, or who wasn't seared by the events as a result of living through them. It's why today I would argue we lack anything close to a definitive book about Richard Nixon, the Nixon presidency, Watergate, the Church Committee, intelligence reforms and investigations in the 1970s. This is still pretty cutting edge in the way of kind of deeply researched archival history. Just hasn't been done yet. And why is it important? Well, if the chaos of the 1960s had a lot to do with electing Richard Nixon, and the overreaction of the 1970s had a lot to do with electing Ronald Reagan, then really what their presidencies have in common are the events of the 1970s, which are usually overlooked as some kind of inconsequential interregnum trapped between a disorderly decade and the dawn of a new era. But let me first start with a personal story and a phone call that changed the direction of my career and has a lot to do with why I'm here today. It'll become clear a little later with how this fits in with what I have to say about Watergate. In early 2008, at the other end of a line was a voice instructing me that Dr. Henry Kissinger would like to see me as soon as possible in New York. I was then a graduate student at Bowling Green, trying to finish a dissertation on US-European relations during the Nixon administration, about to get married, about to move to Texas, and about to begin my first tenure track position. This blue-collar kid from the Midwest, whose rural high school was surrounded by cornfields on three sides, who was a first-generation college graduate in my family, had no business meeting a famous Secretary of State, a particularly famous or infamous one, depending on your perspective. I'd never had contact with him before. I knew him only as a historical figure and an important figure in my dissertation. In a moment, Henry Kissinger went from being a voice I heard many times on his tapes, on Nixon's White House tapes, to someone I was about to meet. He was then 85, so I assumed I might not have another chance to see him. Boy, was I wrong. I've been studying the Nixon tapes and those of his predecessors going back to FDR's installation in the White House of an RCA continuous film machine in 1940 for about 20 years now. But I started with Nixon's, initially to have fresh content for my dissertation in the hope of finishing that up and getting a job and starting a career. But then also more broadly, as I realized no one had mined them for anything close to their full historical value. Probably the same could be said today even, but certainly 20 years ago. And I realized you walk through the stacks of any big library, we're near one as we are here, and you see so many books about a subject. It's daunting as a graduate student. You think, where can I possibly add my own voice? What hasn't been done before? And you immediately assume, just because there's a lot of books written about a subject, that we already know everything there is to possibly know about a subject. And that's not always necessarily true, and a lesson that I pass on to my own students today. But to demonstrate how massive these roughly 5,000 hours of presidential recordings are that we have from FDR to Nixon, even after 20 years of work, I've probably manually transcribed perhaps 10% of them. Incidentally, more than anyone else, as far as I know. They're not only a treasure trove of Americana, but arguably the best guide we have to the modern presidency. And yet they are hiding in plain sight to this day. At my rate of transcription, about 40 double-spaced pages per hour of tape, fully transcribed, they might yield 200,000 pages of transcripts. It took me about 6 months to learn just the basic voices on the Nixon tapes. Some of them are more recognizable, like Nixon's or Henry Kissinger's. But then you have a cabinet room full of Southern congressional chairmen. And by the way, they were largely Southern and chairmen, at that time. And it's pretty difficult to pick out, Wilbur Mills versus, Stennis, or, any one of them gets a little tough. And those are ones I'm not sure we're ever going to get transcribed. Even after living in the South for about 13 years, I can't quite pick out all the different accents and dialects as well as I should. But these tapes, call me old-fashioned, these tapes or derivatives of them, in the case of transcripts, belong to all of us, and they should be more accessible than they are today. This is the greatest guide to the modern presidency that any presidents have ever left us, and we still largely don't know what's on them. And I think about, wouldn't it be fascinating to sort of look at what presidents from FDR to Nixon said about race, or leadership, or war? We don't know. The answer is there, but we don't know yet because we haven't done the work yet. The National Archives cares for the fragile recordings themselves, but considers transcription to be an active interpretation best left to end users. For those of us who think, like me, there's value in learning from the past and applying those lessons to contemporary problems, we've not been able to take advantage of the largest, most valuable data set these presidents have left us. While today, perhaps 10% have been transcribed, in the future, I hope to lead a project to use AI, machine learning, to train models to automate transcription, which is something that's now possible. We're getting to that point now of being able to train models and get 85 to 90% accuracy on a trained model. And when I started out as a graduate student 20 years ago, that no one would have imagined that was possible. And 20 years prior to that, a gigabyte hard drive, not a terabyte, a gigabyte hard drive would take up a whole table. And these recordings are about 10 terabytes, at least my files that are in the clouds. So we've come a long ways and should seize the opportunity that technology provides us. At the time of Henry Kissinger's invitation to meet in 2008, which didn't seem like much of an invitation at the time, more like an offer I couldn't refuse, I hadn't yet published anything meaningful. But I was beginning to dabble in the Nixon tapes and was one of the only people in the country doing so. I still don't know today why Kissinger decided to seek out this graduate student from Ohio who had developed a fascination with a taping system that secretly recorded him for as much as 1,000 hours of Nixon's tapes. He was the first of virtually every living figure from that era who ultimately sought me out, or with whom I've had contact about the history of that era. For me, it felt a bit like time travel, being afforded the opportunity to discuss his materials with these former officials without any agenda, but simply an exchange of ideas, which they were shocked to learn these tapes existed in the first place. What I took away from that experience in the immediate years that followed, and most of them are all gone now, there's just a few left, was that if these recordings were important enough to them to seek me out, that they were important enough that I should pay attention to them too. And it really became a focus of my career since. It wasn't me these figures wanted, it was what I knew that was on those recordings. Some, like Kissinger or Al Haig or Donald Rumsfeld, wanted a record of what they said to the president, either for memoirs or for their own records. Others, like George H.W. Bush or Gordon Liddy, or Bill Safire seemed more interested in what Nixon said about them, sometimes behind their backs in the tapes when they left the Oval Office. Some, like George Shultz, the first reason I ever visited the Hoover Institution in 2012, and the first senior fellow I ever met, seemed betrayed by the fact they'd been recorded without their knowledge. So much so that he could not bring himself to write about that period in his memoirs, representing 3 of the 4 cabinet posts he held during his government career. Even at about age 90, when I first met him, it seemed to be a difficult subject for him to discuss. Many from different backgrounds and points on the political spectrum were shocked by the cherry-picked tape segments that came out after Watergate. As recently as 2013, the National Archives released them in batches of hundreds of hours at a time, and smaller releases made with less fanfare continue to the present day, even as we're here. The National Archives is gradually releasing previously restricted segments that might be a few seconds long, could be a few minutes. They're not required to post the usual Federal Register notice and issue a press release. They're kind of very quietly updating their files, electronic files. And there's only a few of us who are usually aware. And sometimes it's innocuous, but sometimes it's quite, these are sort of contested tapes. So some of them are quite interesting, even compared to some earlier tapes. And the way this usually worked, each release by the National Archives went roughly the same. The National Archives, as I say, would place a notice in the Federal Register that a release was imminent. The Associated Press usually took the lead on writing about it, would assign someone to write their story, usually a journalist by the name of Cal Woodward. No relation to Bob Woodward as far as I know, but perhaps I ought to check that someday and be sure, who would call me to ask what was new in the release, kind of go through quickly and figure out, what do we need to know? What's new for history? What's newsworthy, et cetera. And so I might have a few hours to review 200 to 400 hours of tapes. You can imagine the odds are not exactly on my side. Try to fashion some interesting insights, and he would write it up. And that's all we would know about those tapes until the next release occurred later that year, or perhaps the next year. This was the process the National Archives followed consistently from 2007 to the last planned release in 2013, leaving today about 500 hours that are still unreleased, restricted, never released at all by the National Archives, which are in a kind of archival purgatory with no clear timetable for release, even as of now. With no ability to process such a large volume of materials when they were released, a few seconds of salacious sound bites is all we ever heard about these tapes over the years after each release. Many former officials told me how difficult it was to read about newly released tapes. They were proud of their government service and believed in the president they worked for. It was difficult for them to come to terms with the reality that that was the same man on the tapes they went to work for in Washington. The foul language, the crude anti-Semitism, and even criminal talk in the Oval Office. If only the tapes didn't exist. If only Nixon had burned them, as he was advised to do, then it would be easier to pretend that Nixon never said those things. I cannot fully relate, but after out of college, I worked in the Speaker's office, and then for a House Representatives Committee, and then later for a Near East Affairs Minister in the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, before I realized my true calling was political history and not current politics. But I saw enough firsthand to understand that the relationship between president, or simply the boss, as we always call the boss, and assistant is very asymmetric. A president never has to work again, whereas the assistant depends on the president indefinitely. Something that tarnishes the president might tarnish the assistant too, even if they had nothing to do with it. These government officials from the secret taping era, who proudly gave some of the best years of their lives in service, lived in constant fear of another drip, drip, drip of tapes to be declassified by the National Archives that could in a moment redefine history and their place in it. As a result of that 2008 meeting with Henry Kissinger, he also introduced me to Neil Ferguson. He needs help with the tapes, Kissinger said to me. You must help him with the tapes. Frankly, Neil is already well on his way to writing the definitive biography of Henry Kissinger at this point, so he needs no help from me. But speaking selfishly, One of the best outcomes of Neil's agreement to be Kissinger's biographer is that I have someone else to talk about the history of the 1960s and 70s with, as he also struggles to make sense of it in these 2 volumes. Too often, what passes for the history of that time period is not seriously researched. I think each time I repeat this line, it extends my excommunication from most academic conferences another few years. When it comes to Watergate, I can't say it any better than Neil has said it to me. 50 years is often a sufficient passage of time for revisionism to reshape our understanding of even the most complex and controversial subjects. By then, usually everyone's gone. The records are all open, or at least mostly open. A younger generation demands a history written for them that they can understand. And we're in a proper frame of mind for a reconsideration of what we thought we knew about a subject. Not so with Watergate. The history we have today is remarkably similar to what journalists wrote in the 1970s. The question for us is why? What makes Watergate different? What makes Watergate seem to be the exception to the usual process of historical inquiry? Let me offer a few data points. Of the 4 great landslides of the 20th century, FDR over Alf Landon in 1936, LBJ over Barry Goldwater in 1964, Nixon over George McGovern in 1972, and Ronald Reagan over Walter Mondale in 1984, Nixon's victory in 1972 by several measures was the most decisive of the 4. His national political map was redder than Reagan's, 60.7% of the popular vote versus 58.8. Nixon won 49 states to FDR's 48. And in the Electoral College, Nixon won 96.7% of all electoral votes versus LBJ's 90.3. For reference, I looked it up. Even Vladimir Putin won only 87% of votes in his latest re-election in March 2024. Not that those are the standards we're living up to. I say this to point out not how remarkable Nixon's victory in 1972 was, which it was when you consider his comeback following the twin defeats in 1960 and 1962, but because of how swift his decline was in the months that followed. I know of nothing else like it in modern US history. The first Gallup poll following Inauguration Day in 1973 saw Nixon at 67% approve, 25% disapprove, more than a 2-to-1 ratio in his favor. Within just 4 months, he was underwater, 44 to 45%. And at the time of the August recess, 1973, he was 58% disapprove and 31% approve, nearly a 2-to-1 ratio against him, all within about 6 months, 6.5 months, from January to early August of 1973. Nixon won the votes of over 46 million Americans in November 1972. That's like losing 22 million of those votes by the following summer. It was a decisive reversal of the election result in fewer than 6 months. Mere partisanship or the typical political ebbs and flows do not fully explain such a reversal. Let me also point out how different that era was, if you're like me and might not have been around or were a little too young to remember it. When the House of Representatives initiated impeachment proceeding against Nixon that fall, following the Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973, the nation had not seen such a process in over a century. When President Andrew Johnson was impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act, how quaint the previous effort must have seemed after the experience of the 1960s. The idea that in the 1860s, that while the US Senate provided advice and consent for political appointments, it was less clear when removing someone from office or making recess appointments. And that was the primary charge against Andrew Johnson. In October 1973, I looked it up. The oldest American alive was a woman named Etty Christ, and she was born in 1862. So while she might have remembered Andrew Johnson's impeachment, it is unlikely that learning from history made much of a difference in the course of the Nixon era proceedings. So it took nearly 100 years for the nation to experience its first presidential impeachment of Andrew Johnson. in the late 1860s, and a little over 100 years for the nation to experience its second of Richard Nixon in the early 1970s. Unlike Johnson, who was impeached in the House but acquitted in the Senate trial, the narrative regarding Richard Nixon was that he was uniquely criminal and must be removed from office. This narrative was not inevitable, but constructed. Or as I say, there was no true historical precedent. In 10 years in this country, we went from evening national news programs of 15 minutes in length in the fall of 1963 to our first experience with politics nearly 24/7 in the fall of 1973. I'm not sure we were ready for that. With the editorial pages of most major newspapers saying largely the same thing, it's only 3 national television networks within about 6 blocks of each other in Midtown Manhattan. I remember when working as an executive producer at C-SPAN about 15 years ago, establishing the American History TV series on the weekend. And my old boss, Terry Murphy, would remind me regularly of the constant pressure to fill my 48-hour programming block, each week. You've got to feed the beast was the mantra inside the network. And I can tell you some content was better than others, but the beast was fed. Journalists covering Watergate became celebrities, no longer content with simply reporting the news when the opportunity to star in their own coverage based on the innovation of anonymous sources was far more lucrative. The term Watergate itself, especially its suffix "gate," became synonymous with sleaze and scandal. The special prosecutor was viewed as impartial in the early 1970s. Judges didn't seem interested in politics. Prominent military officials claimed not to vote in order to maintain separation from partisan activity. Senator Sam Ervin, chairman of the most significant congressional investigation, was portrayed as a simple country lawyer and a constitutional expert pursuing the truth. The fact that there were 3 Republicans on his committee demonstrated the bipartisan nature of its inquiry. When Nixon ultimately lost control over his tapes as part of the broader struggle over executive privilege, their content showed that only someone as paranoid as Richard Nixon would have bugged himself and others, or condoned wiretapping or break-ins and the politicization of the US government. In all, Watergate resulted in 69 indictments and 48 convictions. Nixon resigned in disgrace before being impeached in the House or facing trial in the Senate for removal from office, and his pardon by President Gerald Ford in September 1974 was seen as a miscarriage of justice, since the pursuit of Nixon for criminal and civil charges, even after his resignation, was abandoned before it could allow its natural conclusion. This narrative that Nixon was unique was so effectively constructed, deployed, and reinforced that many of the 61% who supported him in 1972 became convinced by it in fewer than 6 months, or did not have the inclination or the ability to challenge it. And even those who worked for Nixon came to doubt the president they worked for, or at least to raise serious questions. And it's clear to me that some of these former officials were not able to resolve their concerns by the end of their lives. When I started working on the Nixon tapes about 20 years ago, I had almost no interest in Watergate. Not because I didn't think the subject was important, but because I assumed we already knew everything or almost everything there was to know. It seemed more attention had been given to that subject than any other from the Nixon presidency. What could I possibly uncover that the myriad of investigations and litigation throughout the 1970s did not? Nixon was probably the most investigated politician in US history, although it's possible he no longer holds that record. When I started the first website dedicated to the Nixon tapes in 2007, nixontapes.org, and answering inquiries from the media, scholars, and members of the public, I would estimate that at least 90% of the inquiries I received had to do with Watergate. Today, by the way, it's exactly the opposite. 90% are on other subjects besides Watergate, which is a pretty sharp reversal in about 20 years, or sharp generational change. Journalists who had made their names, careers, and fortunes writing about the subject of Watergate relished it, but only the 1974 version, I came to learn. The millions of pages of records that have been open for research in the 30 years that followed, as well as about 2,000 hours of Nixon tapes. These figures speak to openness around 2007, when I was starting out my career and going on the tenure track, were of no great consequence for those recognized as experts on the subject of Watergate. New records and new context were inconvenient and either ignored or folded into conclusions established decades before. As someone who first went on that job market in 2007 and 8, in an interview, there was not a chance I would ever mention that I was interested in probing Watergate, using the questions that I challenge my students today to consider when thinking about any historical subject. How do we know something is true? What context do we need? How do we deal with incomplete or conflicting evidence? I knew of no scholar then working on the Nixon period interested in rigorously re-examining Watergate. I'm not sure there's even anyone today. It would have been a career killer for sure for me 20 years ago, starting out. Even the protection of tenure did not ensure safe passage when asking such questions. So fast forward to this day, June 17th, but in 2022, 2 years ago, the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. I was in Washington. That in itself was not unusual because I was often in town for some anniversary or commemoration or event around town, which always took place around June 17th. At a dinner that night with longtime Nixon aide Frank Gannon, who managed to get a reservation at the recently renovated Watergate Hotel. So perhaps it was more of a wake than a commemoration that evening. I commented that it dawned on me earlier that day that it was the first time in my life that Richard Nixon was no longer the #1 political villain in US history. In my view, it was a major shift which presented an opportunity for a fresh look at the entire Nixon period. The irrational Nixon critics, going back to the Alger Hiss era, are dwindling in number as they fade from the scene, and those who replace them have other things on their minds these days. Let's accept the fact there was a kind of Nixon derangement syndrome back then, not only in predictable places, like his political opposition, where you expect to find it, but also the establishment in his own party, cultural elites of all kind, and especially the national media. And their derangement has left its mark on the history we have today. Nixon wasn't chased from office by Democrats alone, but also by Republicans, some of whom had never accepted him since Eisenhower and Nixon steamrolled their favorite candidate, Mr. Republican Robert Taft, in 1952. One of the lessons of Watergate is not that Nixon was excessively partisan. It was that he was not partisan enough. He might have been visceral in his pursuit of Alger Hiss by the standards of the 1940s, but by the late 1960s, the stakes were much higher. I assume presidents since Nixon, who have faced the threat of impeachment and removal from office, figured out how important it is to take care of 34 votes on their side in the Senate, which is sufficient to block 2/3 majority required for removal from office. Nixon didn't know that lesson. If politics is the continuation of war by other means, Nixon was wholly unprepared and almost naive about the nature of the combat he would face in the early 1970s. His 1972 landslide didn't make him all-powerful. Power began to drain from him the moment it was over, because everyone knew he would never appear on another ballot again. Nixon was an easy target, and he always has been. When researching my last book on the 1968 presidential election, I found a document that claimed that Democratic New York Governor Averell Harriman, really exhibit A of the New Deal era Nixon haters, when watching Nixon's 1952 Checkers speech, witnessed even his pet terrier vomit in their house when watching Nixon defended receiving family dog Checkers as a gift. Even on the Republican side of the aisle, there was a joke during Nixon's 1960 campaign that if he wanted to pay a visit to his running mate, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., someone like Nixon would not have been permitted to use the front door at Lodge's North Shore estate in Beverly, Massachusetts. And I'm not aware that Nixon ever did visit him there. Even today, with all that we've learned since, the temptation is too great to treat Nixon as something other than what he was, a serious politician respected by serious politicians. When I was at the Reagan Library a few months ago to look at some newly opened 1984 campaign records, I overheard a conversation between a docent and a museum visitor discussing Nixon, the docent, presumably responding in a way consistent with their official training, said, Richard Nixon did some good things, but he also did some really bad things. I almost wanted to ask, do docents say the same thing about Ronald Reagan? Is the same not true of all political leaders? And if we are honest, even ourselves? Nixon wasn't despised by his worst critics because he was what they said he was. He was despised because he was effective. Only since Nixon's death in April 1994 have we gradually acquired the perspectives needed to re-examine Watergate as a result of the impeachment of Bill Clinton and more recently Donald Trump, and in an even more visceral political era that itself is beginning to make the Watergate era look quaint, as Watergate did for Andrew Johnson's era. No matter where one is situated on the political spectrum, you've seen it done to your side. We now know that some of the investigators who accused Nixon of improper conduct engaged in improper conduct themselves in order to get Nixon. Today, we question the validity and even the constitutionality of special prosecutors. We understand that judges are human and can be influenced by fame and politics. The media landscape today is very different and includes many more perspectives and voices. We understand that impeachment is a political process, first and foremost, without the usual safeguards of a criminal or civil proceeding, which itself can be manipulated. We understand that one of the reasons grand juries operate in secrecy is because it makes it difficult for us to hold them accountable. When it comes to Watergate itself, what wrongdoing can we actually attribute to Nixon himself? I'm not saying the answer is nothing, but is that not a fair question to ask in the process of historical inquiry? Regardless of your answer, my response will be, how do we know that? And what context do we need to evaluate that? If the conventional wisdom today is that the most impeachable thing Nixon did was obstruction of justice, as illuminated by the smoking gun tape in which Nixon and his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, discussed using the CIA to block the FBI investigation of Watergate, even John Dean, formerly known as Nixon's chief critic, has come forward in the past 10 years to say that tape was misinterpreted when it was released in late July 1974, because when it was recorded 6 days after the 1972 break-in, neither Nixon nor Haldeman knew enough to obstruct anything. For the Watergate narrative to hold in 1973 and 1974 that Nixon was a uniquely criminal figure who should be removed from office, we could not be permitted to learn about the misdeeds of others until Nixon was gone, since that was the goal. If the guiltiest person deserves the fairest trial, we were missing the critical context needed to judge Nixon, not just the 61% who supported him in 1972, only to abandon him 6 months into his second term of office, and those who worked for him who later questioned their decision to do so, but all Americans. The system did not work, and the process of historical inquiry has not worked. Well, I'm eager to get to your questions, and I'm out of time. So let me end this way. If Neil Ferguson were here, and so this is dangerous, he might challenge me with a counterfactual. So let me preempt by suggesting one. If the conventional narrative is that Watergate happened because of Nixon, then the counterfactual is that without Nixon, there would have been no Watergate. I'm not so sure. Because of our understanding of Watergate, we have also misunderstood the entire Nixon era. Instead, what I hope to see in the future history is let's re-examine Watergate in its full context, a struggle over presidential power that started 2 decades before, a nation that doubted itself after Vietnam and civil rights, Cold War convulsions that rippled across the globe in the 1960s, and a political system in the midst of a shift not seen since the 1930s, when the New Deal coalition first came together. And what better place than the Hoover Institution to lead this conversation? With the investments the Library and Archives has made in manuscripts collections like those of John Ehrlichman, George Shultz, recently John Price and others. This might be Hoover's first commemoration of Watergate, but I don't think it will be the last. Thank you. So we'd like to get to your questions, and we have the audience here and also an audience on Zoom. So let me say a sentence or two about ground rules. We have a couple of roving microphones going around. So if you identify yourself in the room, we will get a microphone over to you. Just hold your question until we get a microphone in your hands that everyone can see it. And the Zoom audience can also hear your question. And then we'll toggle back and forth between those of you in the room and also whatever might be going on in the online questions and comments.
So we are still in the midst of secret recordings era that's been taken to kind of a new level. You know, we saw just in the last couple of weeks, someone who used, I guess, their cell phone to record live conversations of Supreme Court justices at a time when they were not anticipating they were being recorded. So as a historian, do you have any thoughts about where this digital era of secret recordings is going to take us in terms of your successors who will look back at our era and be trying to do the kind of research that you're doing?
Thank you. Of course, we all have secret recordings now, and sometimes they are recording us secretly, you know, whether we know it or not. My daughter's 10. I sometimes think that if she probably will not be a historian, but if she is, I can't imagine dealing with text messages and recovering signal messages. I mean, for the archivists in the room, the definition of what a permanently valuable record is just kind of blows my mind, you know, compared to like traditional paper memos. You know, even during the Trump years, I was always amazed that he gave so much time to media people who were openly critical, and he allowed record. Bob Woodward recorded how many hours of audio with Trump. So I guess, you know, I don't know the answer. I guess what I hope as a historian is let's make it all available. I mean, sometimes you need restrictions for privacy rights or national security. But I liked 50 years used to be enough time, you know, for everything to be open. But now with longer human lifespans and presidential executive orders allowing national secrecy for intelligence records, this is what Obama changed, 75 years plus, it's taking longer and longer for us to really piece together all the pieces we need for the puzzle. So I think my hope is let's make it all available. If it took 50, you know, my book came out last year, 55 years after the 68 election. I'm not going to be around for the reassessment of what's going on in these current days. My students might not even be around, you know, who are in their 20s. So it's taking longer and longer for us to really figure out what the truth might be, if there is such a thing. But I think what I hope to do is let's figure out eventually. I think we all, these are taxpayer dollars that pay for these public officials. I think we have a right to figure out after some interval of time, you know, what really happened. An online question?
Yeah, we have 2 online questions so far. I'll ask both of them. How was Henry Kissinger's memory during your meetings with him? That's the first question. And the second question is, I'm curious what you think of the acronym for the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP. Was it an inside joke? It seems very strange for a group to choose such an acronym.
Yeah, so Dr. Kissinger was 85 when I first met him. So I like to say he was a relatively young man compared to the full lifespan that he ultimately had. When he was 85, he was pretty sharp. He was then not just running one consulting company, but 2. You know, he was still kind of at the very end of Kissinger McLarty Associates, but also doing his own Kissinger Associates. And he was, until he figured out that I didn't really have an agenda, he was hostile to me. I mean, he had fight in him still at that point. And I found him to be exceptionally sharp at 85. The last meeting I had with him was a couple of years ago. And I felt like he was a little slower, like his recall was a little slower. But once it came back, it was amazing. So I would ask him a question and he almost would kind of pause for a minute. And I didn't know whether I needed to rephrase the question or kind of say it another way. But then he would come back a moment later, almost like he had to go into like his filing cabinet and kind of retrieve the right file and then know what to say. So I certainly don't expect to live that long. And I certainly don't expect, if I do, to be that sharp at that age. But I thought he was really, really exceptional, you know, at both 85 and close to 100. And the second question, this is interesting. You know, I used to always think there used to be a divide. It used to be that Nixon people referring to Nixon's 1972 committee to re-elect the president always used the acronym CRP, and the critics in the press called it creep, because you can see why. And then now, I think everybody says creep. Even a lot of the Nixon people say creep. So yes, you would think that someone in PR or politically minded would figure out, like, how are we going to lose control potentially of our own name and our own acronym? But I'm not aware that anyone gave it much thought because they didn't expect Watergate to happen.
So in evaluating Nixon, you mentioned the Nixon derangement syndrome. And as a young person, I was actually in that camp, I think. And then I've studied him since then, and I have a different opinion. What do you think caused that? What's your opinion on that?
It's complicated. I think in a way, Nixon relished it for a while. I mean, I saw a letter recently. The last book on 68, some of you might know, the really interesting thing I found in the archives that I use a lot in that book was the Reverend Billy Graham's diary. And it was the first book to use that diary. And, you know, Graham lived to be age 99 when he died in 2018. And you're going to hear more about this in the future. He actually kept a diary of his conversations with presidents. And it was 50 some volumes, starting with Harry Truman in 1950. And it goes until Barack Obama in 2014. And so a lot of it I wasn't allowed to see, but I was allowed to see the parts from the 60s. And I remember seeing a letter from Graham's wife, Ruth, to Richard Nixon saying, "You sealed your fate after that Hiss trial." Because in the late 1940s, Nixon didn't just go after Hiss. He went after the establishment. He went after the national media and its coverage. And I think he made enemies of these institutions in the nation that you know he depended on for his career. Now, Nixon also scored a lot of victories in the press, the Checkers speech. I mean, Nixon has some great silent majority speech. I mean, you calculate the sort of wins and losses. Nixon in the media, you assume it's always a negative score, but Nixon scored a lot of victories using the press too. But I suspect it's probably going back to the 1940s. When he made enemies of all the New Dealers, called them corrupt, called the press corrupt, and that stuck with him. They put him out of business in the early 1960s, and ABC even did an hour-long program called The Political Obituary of Richard Nixon. And they brought in Hiss, they brought in Jerry Voorhees, who Nixon ran against Congress in 1946. And it was this whole like cast of characters who openly despised Nixon, and they were all put on a panel by ABC and after the 62 loss for the California governorship. And I think he really was considered dead then. And I think his critics were quite happy about that. And I think he had declared war on them even before they declared war on him.
I have a comment and a question. The first comment is from John Dean. Well done, Luke. You are right. It is time for honest revisionism. Nixon looks very different after Donald Trump. By the way, Bill Sapphire named Creep. So has some insights on that. And then the question is, do you feel that the political power struggle between Congress and the presidency was amplified by the passage of the McCarran Act near the beginning of the Cold War, and something like Watergate was inevitable in the fight over the balance of power between the branches because of the McCarran Act and the almost unchecked power it gave all presidents, including LBJ, along with Richard Nixon, as the Cold War became less driven by paranoia?
I would expect a question like that from John Dean.
One else actually, but
yeah.
the comment was from John Dean.
Well, if it's a comment from John Dean, it's going to involve a 3-hour conversation over lunches to work through what he wrote. I guess I would go back toward the end of my remarks when I talk about Watergate being the culmination of a 20-year struggle over presidential power. that had been growing since the 1940s. So what do I mean by that? Well, that really hasn't been explored by academics all that much. But you could look at, to me, there are several mile markers on the road to that struggle between co-equal branches of government, the rapid growth of presidential power, and the ultimate effort to check that growth in power. And to me, I would look at everything from FDR had an executive order in 1940, around the time of Japanese American incarceration, where wiretapping became more permissible during war, at least as war was beginning to brew in Europe and certainly in Asia. You could look at the post-war reconstruction of the national security community in this country. So the formation of the Pentagon, the restructuring of the service branches, the National Security Act of 1947, the CIA Act of 1949, McCarran Act of 1950, which was mentioned. You've got all these efforts to give more and more power and concentrate it in the presidency. I think Congress wanted to get its hooks into LBJ, and he just got away in time in 1968, in his final year in office, over the war. So I think some of the investigation of Nixon was responding. It was Watergate, of course, but some of it was, I think Congress had wanted to reassert itself for a while against the presidency. And why not Nixon? He was the ideal target, going back to the 1940s. But I'm going to have to be in, I appreciate John's comment. I'll have to be in touch and work through some of his issues.
How important do you think the context of the anti-Vietnam War sentiment in America was in Watergate and Nixon's tapes? For example, do you think he would be able to sort of slip under the radar with these things as other presidents have done? Or would there even be the need for that much paranoia without so much heat on him?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way I think about that issue sometimes is that at the same time, the media was pointing out Nixon's uniqueness at the time that he was the only president to record. People at the time knew that other presidents had recorded and kept that quiet. I remember Alexander Butterfield was a presidential assistant who disclosed the taping system before the Irvin Committee. I believe it was July 16th, 1973. So there's another 50th anniversary. We can come back and talk about tapes next month. And if you look at the New York Times story of the next day, of course, that was when we waited for the news, the next day, it wasn't instantaneous. And if you look at I love the Times machine, where you can go online and look at the full pages of the New York Times and turn the pages and even see the ads. And I ended up down the rabbit hole of like, oh, what was for sale, in department stores back then. And these are my words, not the articles, but the summary of the article basically says what I said in the talk, that only someone as paranoid as Nixon bugged himself and bugged others at a time when people in the government knew that other presidents taped. And then the reporter then goes to a White House comment, which is answered by Fred Bazar, Nixon's counsel for Watergate, who tries to open up a can of worms, and he's unsuccessful. He says something like, well, the president did do recording sort of consistent with the way his predecessors recorded, or something like that. And so then they go to an LBJ spokesperson, who was Joe Califano back then, who's still around today. And I remember I interviewed Califano for the book on Lodge. And sometimes when you interview someone, you're like, well, I have questions I have to ask. But if I have time at the very end, I want to ask the question I really have in mind. But I'm going to save it for the end because I don't want them to throw me out before I get to the ones I really have to talk to. And so Califano in the New York Times article said something like, that's a smear of an honor to accuse Johnson of taped, which is what Bazart's quote did. Califano's quote, and you can look up the exact text, but I've got it close. That's a smear of an honorable man who's not here to defend himself, because Johnson had died 6 months before. So they don't really answer the question, but it strongly leads you to believe that Johnson had not taped, and there was no follow-up that you can see in the article. And then it goes to the spokesperson for the Secret Service, who says, oh, Kennedy did no taping. And we didn't find out Kennedy had taped publicly until 1982. That's remarkable. I mean, his tapes were 10 years older than Nixon's, yet they stayed secret for 10 more years beyond Nixon's. And so the question I wanted to ask Cavanaugh was, at the time that you gave that answer to the New York Times, were you aware that LBJ had taped? So you can see why I saved it to the very end. He said, yeah, of course. He's like, well, at least the telephone tapes. Now, I understand you work for a politician. You're going to defend the boss. That's politics. I don't hold that against you. But the Secret Service quote is the one I can't explain. Because in 1973, that was Nixon's Secret Service. And in 73, the Kennedy agents who installed the taping system on behalf of the Kennedy White House had already done oral histories. The Kennedy, they weren't released yet, but there were a lot of people who had evidence to challenge the idea that Nixon was unique in lots of ways, and it stayed secret. So that one I can't explain. That one I'm still thinking about. That's as best as I can answer your question. Yeah, one more, time for one more. Yeah, right there.
Hi, can you tell me who it is that goes through the tapes to see what's classified or sensitive and what can be released?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a bit of a conundrum when it comes to government secrecy, of course, because those who really know how it works can't talk about it. And those on the outside don't really know how it works, but we're free to speculate all we want. So there's various executive orders and statutes that apply to each presidential administration. The primary one that applies to Nixon's is a statute that President Ford signed in December of 1974 called PRIMPA, the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act of 1974. And what's notable about this statute, I don't usually quote from statutes or name them. This one's notable for Nixon primarily because it prioritized what the National Archives had to release from the Nixon records. And what PRIMPA basically says is you have to release, this is to the National Archives, you have to release the entirety of the Watergate records before you begin to release anything else. And so that alone shaped the history that we have to this day, because people for decades, that's why 20 years ago, over 90% of the inquiries I got were about Watergate. That's all we heard. The Nixon Library down in Yorba Linda in Orange County didn't become part of the federal system of presidential libraries until 2007. The records, the Nixon White House records, didn't begin migrating from the DC area down to his presidential library until 2010, 2011. So in a sense, this is not a 50-year-old presidency. It's more like a presidency that ended around those years, because the records have really only been discoverable in that amount of time. And so even the statutes themselves have shaped the particular history that we have. It's not an accident why it is what it is. And by this time, if you look at a similar period of time for the Kennedy history or the Johnson history, and there's lots of things close there, the history was much more mature at that point than it is for Nixon. And so I think people consistently assume it's been done, but it's one more reason why it hasn't been.
Thanks so much, Luke. Thanks to the audience online. Thanks, John Dean, for the question. Look forward to speaking with you. And please join us for the reception outside. Thank you all for being here.